Hello, this is Ken Ferry, this week's Boots in the Field. Question of the week that I want to cover today has to deal with seed treatments. Question that I've been receiving as I did meetings throughout Iowa and parts of Illinois about sudden death and seed treatments and whether we need them or not. And the question has come about in a couple different ways, but to summarize it, the call would be something like this. I haven't seen sudden death in 2 or 3 years. So is it really worth to treat anymore for sudden death? Well, there we have to think about sudden death in itself. Just because we haven't seen the conditions most likely means that, or we haven't seen the sudden death, is because we haven't seen the conditions to make sudden death happen on your farm. We remember with sudden death, as we talked about, is kind of a two-stage infection to some extent. We have to get the plant infected in the spring of the year and early, and then later on in the season, we're going to actually see the toxins from that infection take out the plant. So as we think about it, the bean goes in the ground. The day it goes in the ground, it's subject to attack. The longer it's in the ground, the bigger the risk. And once it gets to the first trifoliate at V1, it's pretty hardy after that. So if you can manage to get that bean in the ground and get it up, get it to V1 without being infected, you're going to be good to go. Now, the fungus itself operates pretty good at the low temperatures in the soil. Once we get above that 65, 70 degree soil temperatures, the fungus itself slows down, or the risk of infection slows down at that point. So it becomes a point of what kind of risk are we putting it in there. But just because we haven't seen this disease doesn't mean it's not there. I've worked with farms where we put them into a corn-on-corn rotation for 5 or 6 years, bring them back, put them back into soybeans, and they get nailed by sudden death, meaning that it's not going to go away. It's going to be in the soil, and it's going to be part of what you have to deal with out there itself. But warmer soils is one way to get around that. Now, of course, we know that. That's why we don't see much sudden death in our double crop beans. It's actually rare to see it because the soil is too warm for that fungus to do its thing. Once we've got that bean planted, though, we can also be infected and not suffer big consequences. So we saw a number of fields this spring that were infected. We could tell by looking at the root system and seeing that kind of a bluish-gray mold on the taproot itself. But then you have the second stage of that disease, of course, and that's going to be a wet July, a wet early August, where conditions are saturated out there and tougher conditions for that plant in the reproductive stages. And all of a sudden, then the sporing bodies at that taproot explode and they send up toxins, and it's the toxins that you see kill the plant. So the visual symptoms you see above ground, you see all them damaged leaves, you think, well, that must be where the sudden death is. It's still down on the taproot. You're just seeing the effects of it up on top of the plant. So again, you have the early conditions, how long it takes this bean to get out of the ground, how big the infection can be, and then you have to have the follow-up conditions in July or August. So if we plant later, we get around that stress. But it's a situation where earlier planting has been kind of the big hubbub of the winter as far as guys trying to move their planting window forward for the yield advantage to early planting. And we know that April beans for us here in Central Illinois are our better beans. We've known that for some time. And we used to plant a lot of our beans in April back in the 80s and in the 70s. That's where we were planting a lot of our full season beans. About the mid-90s when sudden death showed up, it changed that situation. There's too much sudden death damage taking place in the mid-90s, and by the 2000s, everybody had moved their planting dates back again where you're fighting the sudden death. There's no quicker way to take an 80 bushel bean back down to 35 or 40 bushel than get it infected with the sudden death out there itself. So when we think about treating the bean, as a question, should we treat the bean? Then the question comes back, one, what kind of history do you have of sudden death? Have you ever seen the sudden death in the field itself? And if sudden death is there, then you're going to consider that field infected. Now, a lot of times it's not the whole field, and it tends to show up in certain areas of the field more repetitious than others, but it's how much damage does a field typically have due to sudden death. So think back to those wetter July, August situations when we followed a cool spring, how much damage did that field actually receive? And that takes us back to, do we have the disease triangle? So is the disease present? Most fields here in central Illinois, it is, especially our heavier, poorly drained soils, it's there. Then the question is, what's the susceptibility of your genetics to sudden death? That's going to be part of it, as far as do you pick up any tolerance or resistance in the genetics that you're working with, and there is a difference. Then, of course, it comes down to the big one, is when you're going to plant. More one person questioned whether we should treat the seed or not, then ask them, when do you think about planting your beans this year? I'm going to plant them all in April. Based on the past 2 years of results, we're going to move our beans into that April window. As soon as we move those beans into that early planting window, our risk goes up considerably. April planted beans could take anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks to get out of the ground. That's a long time for them to be infected with the sudden death. So when we start talking about early planted soybeans, our first recommendation is to make sure you get them treated with your fungicide or fungicide insecticide for your normal molds. And remember, we got warm molds and we got cold molds that we're going to be able to ding that crop, such as your pythiums and stuff like that. So we want those protected. But when we move into April, not only do we have to have our standard fungicide treatments, our recommendation would be to protect yourself from sudden death if you have a sudden death history in that field. And I'm not talking a sudden death history the last couple of years. If you've ever seen sudden death in that field, we're going to say you're taking a big risk there, and I would treat it for the sudden death. Situation where you realize if we plant these beans early and we have a freeze after those beans come out of the ground, we're going to start this process all over. So keep that in mind as well. We can freeze corn off at the ground, it's going to come back. We freeze the corn off at the ground, our beans off, we're going to do it over as well. And I know talking with a number of people saying, well, when should we start planting these beans in April? Truly, you ought to be planting those beans when you can plant corn. So when you can maintain temperatures above 50 degrees through the night, make it a good window for planting corn. That's also a window that you possibly can pick and put those beans in. Those beans are going to grow slow, and the disease is going to grow fast. So my recommendation, again, is protect yourself. After we get into second, third week in May, then our data, as we showed you, it gets tougher. It's tougher to make seed treatment pay, and it's tougher to make the sudden death applications pay. You can get freak events like we did 2 years ago in the first part of May, where we had the Mother's Day massacre, and it took some of those beans 20 days to get out of the ground after that cold weather and pounding rain. And we had bigger responses to managing sudden death in 2016 in the Mother's Day massacre than we did in some of our early April beans that came out of the ground itself. But it comes back to answering those questions. Are we planting early? Do we have the disease present? Do we have susceptible genetics out there? What are we working with? Whether we're going to treat it. Our recommendation is to treat all those early beans, not only for your regular disease, but for the sudden death, and try to put that worry out of your mind from that perspective. Again, we could have a great year, we don't see any sudden death, and then you just spent $12 or $14 you're probably not going to get back. But that's an easier pill to swallow, especially if you're picking up 5-10 bushel on your bean yields to early planting, than it is to deal with the amount of sudden death we had here about 3 or 4 years ago when we took all these fields down into the mid-40s itself. So with that, I hope that helps. Keep her safe, keep her moving.